In this video, we're going to look at another fallacy called the appeal to common practice, and we'll do 8 things. We'll look at what the appeal to common practice is. We'll focus in on the structure of the argument involved there so that you can see how it works. We'll talk about why it's a fallacy, what's wrong with this kind of reasoning. Then we'll go over several common situations in which you should be on guard and expect to look for this fallacy to be made. We'll look at 3 examples of the fallacy. If you'd like to see further examples, we'll be uploading other videos that are just focused on providing you examples later on down the line. Then we'll talk about what you can do to sort of put yourself on guard to spot this fallacy as it's occurring. For the students out there who have to take exams on this sort of thing, we'll talk about what other fallacies it might get mixed up with. And then we'll finish by talking about how you can avoid falling into this fallacy, this bad line of reasoning in your own thinking, your own reasoning, and your own communication with others. So what is the fallacy of appeal to common practice? This is a fallacy that's similar to several others, and in some textbooks you will find it lumped in under other fallacies. I like to distinguish it as something that's separate so that we can keep it distinct and focus in specifically on what's wrong with this kind of reasoning. Sometimes it's called mindless conformity. At times you'll see people lump this under what's called the bandwagon fallacy, which is also used to talk about the appeal to popularity. Now, what is the fallacy of appeal to common practice at its basis? It's arguing that because something is done by many or most or all people, and it can also be used for groups, that whatever it is that we're talking about is for that reason good or reasonable or right. So it has to do with institutions and practices. It doesn't have to do so much with beliefs. It has to do with what people do. And it has to do with the status of it. If we look at the structure of this fallacy, it's pretty straightforward. There's a premise, and somebody will just make an observation. Well, a lot of people engage in this particular practice, and we'll call it X. And the conclusion is, well, X is right or good or reasonable as a practice. And now, how do we get there? Notice that there's this hidden premise or implicit premise on the way, which is that if many people engage in a practice, that practice is or thereby becomes right, good, or reasonable. That's the weak point of this fallacy. The mere fact of people doing something doesn't make it necessarily reasonable or good or right, even better. We can talk in terms of comparative terms. It doesn't necessarily make a practice better, the fact that more people do it. It could be more people are actually misguided or, doing things on bad motives. So let's look now at how we might represent this graphically. And again, a very straightforward fallacy. You've got all these people grouped together, and you're saying that all of these people or groups engage in some sort of practice, and we'll call the practice X. So person 1 does X, person 2 does X, person 3 does X, and we could multiply it as much as we want to. And the conclusion is that X thereby is good or right or reasonable for people besides all of these other people, that it's good or right or reasonable in general. Now, what is wrong with this kind of reasoning? Why is this a fallacy? There's a basic confusion that's being committed, and the confusion is between saying that a practice is widespread or commonly practiced and coming to the judgment that the practice is good or right or reasonable. These are 2 separate things, and I think for quite a few people, these easily get mixed up together. Particularly for people who don't have a lot of practice in doing moral reasoning and people who are not particularly developed. Children often fall into this sort of, well, it's being done, so it must be the right thing. And there's a really basic sort of idea behind this that's a topic for a bigger discussion. One of the things that you want to keep in mind is that often claims about just how widespread a practice is might be inflated or based on shaky evidence, anecdotal information. everybody in my family does X, so I'm assuming that everybody in my town does X. That means that X is okay to do. Could be that your family is the screwed up ones, the outliers, the ones who transgress the norms. You have to be careful with that. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is that we know from many experiences and from history, if we look back at the whole wealth of human screw-ups, we know that the popularity of a practice doesn't thereby make it right or good or reasonable. So the mere fact that a lot of people do something doesn't mean that it's the right thing to do. We see this all over and over again with all sorts of historical examples. And there's also a problem. We can call this a comparative problem. If I'm coming from some sort of group where a practice is common, and the group over there does something totally different that contradicts our practice, it's possible for somebody who buys into this sort of line of reasoning to say, well, there's a contradiction because that's a good thing to do and this is a good thing to do, but that's the opposite of this. Now, if you're a thoroughgoing relativist, of an individual kind or a cultural kind, not a problem for you. But then you've got a whole other can of worms that you've opened up, and you probably won't be able to do critical thinking if you make that sort of assumption. What are some common situations where we're going to see this fallacy coming up? So most of the time it's coming up as a defense when some practice is being questioned, when somebody's saying, well, you shouldn't do this, or this is an unreasonable thing to do, or that's not right, or they bring up something else that's transgressing somebody's rights, and so somebody will say, well, a lot of people do this, so it must be okay. It must be the smart thing to do. And you'll see this in politics and policy making a lot. Actually, all across the spectrum, there is a kind of weakness of mind that a lot of politicians fall into over time. I think it's sort of what we call a professional deformation, where they assume that if something is in fact commonly practiced, it must be okay to do, and they sort of convince themselves of it. So that's one area. Finance. You'll see a lot of people saying that because we do things this way at this time, that's the right way to do it. That's the reasonable way to do it. There's many different ways to do things financially. There's also a lot of people who make dumb financial decisions across the marketplace. Some of them very smart people, some of them not so smart people. Some of them, seemingly well-informed, some not so well-informed. And you don't want to go by just what people do as the standard for what they ought to do. Marketing and advertising. Here we see it being done in a arguably more manipulative way, because quite a bit of marketing and quite a bit of advertising specifically, advertising you can understand as part of marketing, is oriented towards trying to make people think that things that they wouldn't have a good reason to purchase or to agree to are a good idea. And one way that you can do this is by saying, well, look, everybody else is doing this sort of thing, or lots of people do this sort of thing, therefore it's a good idea for you. Personal relationships, again, people often tend to take their cues from what other people do. So if you come from a background where everybody cheats on their spouses, there's probably a strong tendency for you to think that cheating on your spouse is just the way it is and that it's okay. Educational settings. This is an interesting one. It shouldn't be the case that people make appeals to common practice and just say, well, that's just the way it's done, or that's just what we've been doing. For example, why do we use Bloom's taxonomy? I think that for some educators, it's because they've actually read Bloom. If you've ever read Bloom, pretty dry stuff, but also pretty eye-opening, because what we present as Bloom's taxonomy is, in some respects, quite different than what Bloom himself, has in these interesting works. Interesting to me, at least. Dry to most other people. I think that a lot of educators have just got this, there's like 6 levels to things, and we have action words with them, and we know that this is this kind of activity is a level 4 activity, and they're just going by common practice in a lot of cases. Aesthetic matters. Here we're talking about anything from food, wine, and other drink, to home decoration, to music, to the fine arts. When I say music, I mean like your iTunes, which could include the fine arts, but quite often don't. People will often make inferences about how things ought to be done with respect to these on the basis of common practice. There's actually whole magazines that are kind of devoted to this. You could think about men and facial hair, right? Used to be 50 years ago that a clean-shaven face was the way to go, and having something like this would mark you as a little bit eccentric. There's all sorts of weird variations that guys have, and you can get a magazine and see, well, we should have it, have a soul patch, just that little thing here, or just the mutton chops or stuff like that. And you can get it to catch on by saying, well, look, a lot of people are doing this, therefore you should do it. So those are all good examples. One thing I do want to point out, when we say that relevantly similar people or cases ought to be treated similarly on grounds of fairness, that's not this fallacy. So saying, look, we respect this person's rights, therefore we should, and this person and this person and this person, therefore we should respect this person's rights over here in a slightly different situation. That's not a fallacy, because we're not just saying, well, we've got this, this common practice of respecting rights. We're saying, no, rights are something that ought to be respected, and they ought to be respected whether a few people do it or whether a whole bunch of people. We're giving independent grounds for that. Let's look at some examples. Here's a common thing that comes up, justifying corruption, justifying some sort of wrongdoing. In this case, it's about bribery. What do you mean we shouldn't take bribes? Everyone else does it. You can see it going on in all the other divisions. Why shouldn't we get ours? And the conclusion there is, therefore, it's right for us to take bribes, just like everybody else. And this is, a clear example of a fallacy of common practice. It's saying that in all these other contexts, other people are engaging in this practice, therefore the practice is the right practice. But it's not a right practice. And you might say, well, what about countries where, it's the expectation and, in order to get business done, you have to give bribes. If you want to say that sort of thing should be acceptable, you need to find some other grounds other than it's just what everybody does. Maybe some sort of independent justification would be possible for allowing bribery, allowing corruption, but it has to be independent of just saying that's the prevailing practice. Let's look at the second example. Here's a kind of a funny one. We're all over the map when it comes to expectations about men and women in dating situations, in relationships, and sometimes this gets poised as equality versus chivalry. Old school versus, modern and all that. Here's just, a good example of a failure of thinking. Look, I don't expect you to open the car door for me or to pull out my chair, but yes, I do expect you to open the door to the restaurant, and you're definitely paying for this meal. That's what women expect on a date. And so the conclusion is, guy, therefore you should pay for the meal. Now, is there an appeal to common practice going on here? If she's actually saying that, that's what women expect on a date, because this is what actually happens on dates is men pay for women. They don't open the car doors anymore. That's not a common practice anymore, right? Or pull out the chair. But they should at least, when the bill comes, put the credit card down on it before she can, get out her wallet, or however you want to put it, right? Well, that's an appeal to common practice. It could be that there are good grounds for why men should pay, for meals on dates, but this is not a good reason, just the mere fact that it's a common practice. Let's look at a third example. This is one that comes to me from thinking about financial management, money management. There's this prevailing viewpoint that everybody should have a mortgage, that it's smart to keep a mortgage. You get a deduction on your taxes, and a lot of people think that that's the reason why you shouldn't pay off your probably largest debt, unless it's a student loan debt in the case of some people. So it runs like this. Everybody's got a mortgage if they can afford to buy a house. You get the deduction on your taxes. That's why people don't pay it off early. What are you doing making extra payments? And the conclusion is you shouldn't pay off your mortgage early. So is there an appeal to common practice here? I think that there is. You could, in fact, construct an argument out of this saying, look, it's important to get the deduction on your taxes. And then that could be, questioned on independent grounds. You could say, well, is it better to have that deduction, or is it financially? The numbers actually tell you it's better not to be paying interest, because the deduction doesn't, give you like the full interest off your taxes, right? But the real claim here is everybody's got a mortgage if they can afford to buy a house. Everybody else is keeping a mortgage, therefore you should keep a mortgage. That's an appeal to common practice. How do you spot the fallacy of appeal to common practice? So here's a couple pointers. When the response to bringing a practice into question brings up the ubiquity, that's a word that means being spread, being everywhere, being almost every place that you look, brings up the ubiquity or the widespread nature of the practice. Look to see whether that's the only or the main grounds for that response. If it is, then you probably do have a fallacy there. When something new in one context is being proposed on the basis of it being common practice in other similar contexts, again, see whether there's any other good grounds for adopting it being provided, or whether they're just saying, well, they do it over here, so we ought to do it over here. And the third thing is, be on guard for a certain kind of person, the people who typically blur together the value of practices with their popularity. A lot of people fall into this trap. When you know that somebody is of that sort, well, you want to be a little bit more skeptical of their arguments. You want to take a look at them more closely. Now, what's not the fallacy of appeal to common practice? There's a couple different fallacies that you can mix this up with. And I have this here for the benefit of the students who have to prep for exams or homework or, tell these apart. Arguments that justify a behavior by pointing out that somebody else, but not a whole bunch of other people, but somebody else is doing the same thing, are often two wrongs make a right. So if I say, it's okay for, well, here Aristotle has a great example. He actually says this guy was being criticized for dragging his father. He got angry at him, dragging him up to the threshold, if I remember, like the threshold of the yard. Or maybe it was the doorway. And people said, look, you shouldn't be dragging your father by the hair. That's a bad thing to do. And Aristotle says that this guy said, well, he did that to his dad, and he did it just that far. So provided I'm not going beyond the threshold, I'm not actually doing anything wrong. Now, that's about a practice, right? But it's basically saying this practice is okay because that other idiot over there is doing it, or somebody's doing it to me. Arguments that have to do with many people believing something is true are more likely a case of appeal to popularity. Appeal to popularity and common practice sometimes get blurred together. The dividing line between them is that appeal to popularity has to do with beliefs, and common practice has to do with practices. There is, a little bit of wiggle room between them, admittedly. When the appeal is being made to the long time that a practice has been in place, it's more likely an appeal to tradition. So, if you're talking about a practice that's been, done for a long time, and they're saying, well, it's one of our traditions, that's not common practice. Oftentimes people will make an appeal like that precisely because the practice that they're engaging in isn't a common practice anymore, but it, might have been in the past when it was being adopted and continued. Not every argument that points out that people or situations are treated similarly is a fallacious argument. Like I pointed out, if we're talking about basic fairness and we're saying that people deserve to be treated similarly when their cases are similar, that's not an appeal to common practice. So you don't want to mislabel things that are not fallacies as fallacies. Finally, how do you avoid making this fallacy? So you want to pay close attention to your own assumptions, your own ways of inference and reasoning. Try not to avoid the frequency or the ubiquity of a practice with its rightness or goodness or reasonableness. If you find that you're doing that quite often, then you want to pay close attention. You may have a bad mental habit that you need to try to break or replace or overcome. Another thing you can do that helps out, remind yourself about the many practices that were or are common but turn out to be wrong or bad or unreasonable. This will help you keep in mind that this line of reasoning does have some weaknesses. And then if you find yourself falling into the fallacy, if you find yourself making a bad argument, try to see whether you can come up with better grounds that would justify what your claim is to another person, another reasonable person, without just saying, well, look over there, all these other people are doing it. The last thing I want to say, this video is part of a series discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to a whole new channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, reasoning, and argumentation. So if you enjoy this video or you find it useful for your own development, your own critical thinking, share it with other people and come back to the channel because we'll be constantly uploading new content. It's going to keep growing and growing and growing until there's hundreds of resources here for you.